Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out. So how many people here have seen a Tim Burton movie?
Do I even have to raise my hand?
All right. So I think pretty much everyone here has seen one. So what's your favorite Tim Burton movie? Anyone? If you can choose one. Yes?
Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Mars Attacks.
Okay, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Mars Attacks. Who else?
Big Fish.
Big Fish. All right. Yeah, Kevin?
Beetlejuice and Ed Wood.
Beetlejuice and Ed Wood. Ed Wood is probably one of my all-time favorites, especially being a filmmaker. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about Tim Burton. So his style, where his inspiration comes from, the body of his work, some of the background to how he got into film directing. And, I'm only going to be able to scratch the surface. I'm not going to be able to delve deep into every single film, but I want to kind of show some trends that you may already be aware of and some other things you may think about when you think about what makes a Tim Burton film a Tim Burton film. Go ahead, next slide. So I have a few Tim Burton quotes sprinkled throughout because I think it's good to hear his voice not only through his films but from his own mouth. So one person's craziness is another person's reality. And he's talked about how things that he perceives as, normal in his mind, studio executives or others may see as, whoa, that's too dark, or that's too scary, or that's, we're not sure if we want to put our money into that, or why are you doing this in black and white? So it's really trying to be true to himself of what he thinks is best for a film, and whatever he thinks, he hopes that the film he wants to make will resonate with an audience. Okay, next. Okay, so let's brainstorm. I've put up a few Tim Burton movies titles up here. Edward Scissorhands, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Nightmare Before Christmas, and Batman Returns. So Burtonesque. How many people have heard the term Burtonesque? Okay, so when you're thinking about, it's when you see a movie and you go, even if you didn't know it was Tim Burton directing it, you definitely know it by the time you see, the film unfolding. So what are some images or words that come to mind when you think of the films of Tim Burton? What makes a Tim Burton
Curls
film?
and swirls.
Curls, swirls, spirals, maybe. What else? Stripes. Hence my tie.
Cartoony proportioned, cartoon-esque, proportioned physiques.
Oh, okay, so cartoony proportions.
Thin, short, round, and
Okay, so different body types, different, very distinct characters based on body types, shapes, ages, maybe exaggerated. Okay. Anyone else? All right, well, let's look at a few on a list here. Go ahead. So some things people think of when they think of Tim Burton films can be that it's macabre, okay? So dark humor, whimsical, gothic, quirky, fantastical, beautiful or artistic imagery, weird. A lot of the characters are loners. You have dead dogs in a number of the films. Stripes, as we mentioned. Cemeteries, monsters, eccentric characters, windmills, and stop-motion animation, whether it's exclusively a stop-motion animated film or stop-motion added into a live-action film. Go ahead to the next slide. So a little bit about Tim Burton. So a lot of people want to know what makes someone tick. They make these kinds of films, so what kind of background might they have that develops that kind of mind, okay? So he himself was a bit of a loner. He did have a brother who is also an artist. He had parents, a mother and a father, but they didn't necessarily connect on very many levels. He was born in Burbank, which he saw as a very vanilla kind of place. It's very much, if you look at Edward Scissorhands, the idea of just all the neighborhoods, it's summer all year round. It's really hard to tell, any kind of interesting thing going on. And that's one reason he liked Halloween and he liked Christmas, that was the only time that the neighbors and the neighborhood would transform itself into something, new and exciting, something different. He loved B-movies. He would go to B-movies all the time. You could see 3 movies at the drive-in for 50 cents. Check out whatever Z-grade films were showing. a lot of films with, Dracula and monsters and, old Roger Corman films, things like that. And he really admired Vincent Price for his performances in the various films he saw him in. So he started to make some stop-motion animation films himself. He was very inspired by Jason and the Argonauts and things like that. And eventually in high school, he learned that, he discovered that he didn't really like to read. He kind of grew up on television. His parents saw it as, well, pretty much that's the babysitter for you. We don't have to deal with you. Let the TV do with you. And they used to show a lot of weird movies and things on television that you said you really can't probably get away with these days, but you'd see all kinds of crazy things. So he was inspired. Instead of writing a book report, say on Houdini, he would make a little film where he plays Houdini escaping from a railroad track or whatever the case may be, and would get an A. And so he saw that as a way of being able to succeed by telling stories, by getting a grade, doing something he loved. At this point, he wasn't thinking about being a film director. All this time, he was also an artist. He was drawing, he was doodling, he was making characters, creatures. I have an entire coffee table book of just Tim Burton's, primarily his drawings, his illustrations, things that he, would come up with that are part of the Tim Burton style. So he got some recognition, primarily more than for making little films, for his art, and he ended up getting a scholarship and going to Cal Arts and studying there, which eventually was basically the feeding, the feeder into the Disney empire of, you'd start there and they groom people to become animators for Disney, and he eventually got a job at Disney. But if you think of Tim Burton and you think of the Disney style, do you think that those two styles match? Well, not so much. So he would sit in his studio drawing all kinds of weird things. And he said that, he pretty much felt like, well, he was busy all the time doing his own stuff, but nothing he made would ever get used. But he did make some friends there who saw the potential for his talent, even if it wasn't the Disney style. And he was able to make the short films Vincent, which was all stop motion animation, and I'm going to show you in a moment. Frankenweenie, which was his first live action film, 20-minute version. And then also for the newly developed Disney Channel at that time of the 80s, he made a Japanese casted Hansel and Gretel film, which was pretty out there. Some of his other inspirations include Dr. Seuss, Vincent Price, Edgar Allan Poe, and those stop motion specials that we're all familiar with The Year Without a Santa Claus and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and all those. So we'll go ahead and take a look at Vincent. And the reason I want to show Vincent is because it pretty much, I think it summarizes many of those things we think of as pure Burtonesque, okay? Okay, you can let the credits roll while I talk. So, he was very fortunate to get Vincent Price. He was really the person that helped make the project possible by agreeing to narrating it. And what mattered to Tim was that, it wasn't just a fan film of "I love you, Mr. Price, gee golly, I'm your biggest fan." He saw that the material, really resonated with him in a way that was, beyond just making, a fan film or admiring him. So they had become friends, and then was eventually in his, Edward Scissorhands as the scientist. Any questions or comments about that film? Yes.
The poetic rhythm is Dr. Seuss.
Yes. Right. Right. Yeah, he was very inspired. He loved things like The Grinch That Stole Christmas, which, definitely alludes to the fact that why he made The Nightmare Before Christmas, those kinds of holiday specials that really, resonate with you. He also liked, the books of Roald Dahl, and one reason he ended up doing Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Okay, next slide. Movies are like an expensive form of therapy for me. Okay, so he takes on, for every project he takes on, it has to resonate with him in some way. He has to be able to connect to it, relate to it, feel like it's worth his time, his energy, and that he can relate to the characters or the themes of the story in some way. Because movies cost a lot, they take a lot of time, so you have to have part of yourself invested. He's not the kind of director, he said, that just, hey, here's a script, we want you to do it, and you just do it, because you're an action movie director, so you just do every action movie that comes along. He doesn't quite operate that way. The way he got into the Hollywood system is very different than how most directors get there. Go ahead, next slide. So, Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Okay, so how many people knew that Tim Burton directed Pee-wee's Big Adventure? Okay, so he really lucked into it. He said it was the easiest job he ever got, and even since, even after becoming an established director. He made the Frankenweenie short film with Shelley Duvall, who essentially got it into the hands of Paul Rubens, who plays Pee-wee and was already an established character, and said, yeah, I want this guy to be the director for my film, and they brought him on board. And he said it really helped that both he and Paul Rubens were very much in sync in terms of, the funny ideas and crazy ideas and their view of looking at the world. So he said it was a really pleasurable experience. And the film came out, it's become a comedy classic, but it had mixed reviews at the time, but it did make money, showing that Tim Burton was a profitable director. The film showcased a number of things we associate with Burton. A weird outsider, surreal experiences, scary clowns, dinosaurs, film studio backlots, and stop motion animation. So how many people have seen Pee-wee's Big Adventure? Okay. Music by Danny Elfman. Danny Elfman was the lead singer of Oingo Boingo. So they did Weird Science. So they connected. He liked his music, and this was the first feature film score Danny Elfman had done. And they would become longtime collaborators, working on nearly every Tim Burton film together. Okay, next. It's hard to find logic in things sometimes. That's why I can't analyze things too much, because it often doesn't make much sense. Okay, so a lot of times when he's approaching a film, a lot of people have a critique of him is that his storytelling, or some of the the plot, the details of plot aren't as solid as some films might be. But he likes to go for a feeling. If you feel a certain way from a mood, from a character, that the plot can be a lot more loose. It doesn't have to be a specific. You don't have to answer every question, like why is this person's skin green, or why is this person wearing that, or why is this world it is, if it makes you feel a certain way. So he's always writing a balance between having the story be coherent, but also having very interesting characters and visuals and moods. Okay. So that brings us to Beetlejuice. It was definitely a very manic type movie. How many people have seen Beetlejuice, starring Michael Keaton? So Beetlejuice himself only appears in the film, I think, for under 20 minutes, I believe? 16, exactly. So, yeah, so it seems like he's in there more because of the performance Michael Keaton gives, but a lot of that was done with improv, working with Michael Keaton, creating that character. Originally, he wanted Sammy Davis Jr. for the role, and the studio said, no. So, hey, babe. So, just picture Billy Crystal doing Sammy Davis Jr. So, it was one of those scripts that was just as I described. Very crazy, very loose, and that's one reason he liked it. He was offered a lot of scripts after Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and they were all kind of just dumb comedies and so forth, and he wanted something really interesting. So this was up his alley, but went through a lot of rewrites, and they eventually brought it to like a person who was known to be a really good script doctor at, in structure and everything, and worked on it, and eventually he said, this is the world of the dead and poltergeist, and goes, it doesn't have, this is not a literal thing. It does not have to be as tightly structured. He was given a very low, considering the amount of visual effects for the movie, he was given a very low budget for the visual effects. Worked somewhat to his advantage in the sense that he was fine with having them look kind of cheesy and not look like real blood or real things. Okay. And he had a lot more creative freedom on this film because he wasn't dealing with Pee Wee Herman, who was an established character. This was all new, so he could really, put his stamp on it. He also commented that, Alex Baldwin had made comments after the film, and he felt like he never really got it. He didn't think Alex Baldwin really understood kind of the tone or where the film was coming from. It was also criticized that the Maitland characters, the husband and wife, were boring. But they're they're set up in contrast to all the wacky, crazy characters that surround them. Go ahead, we'll show the Beetlejuice trailer. Okay, and I'm showing a number of trailers. I won't show visuals for every film, but it gives you a taste really quickly of what the characters are like, the costuming, the worlds that he creates, the tone, the lighting, the makeup, all those things we think of as Tim Burton. And when you see this movie, even if you didn't know Tim Burton directed it, it has a very distinct, unique look to it. Okay, next. Okay, so after that, once he'd proven that he was bankable, his Beetlejuice was a surprise hit, made money. Pee-wee Herman, Pee-wee's Big Adventure made money. So finally they said, okay, we can see that you can do a lot with a little budget. Here's a big budget movie. Here's Batman, okay? And then eventually he would go on to do Batman Returns. The first one, was definitely a learning curve, right? Because you're dealing with a gigantic action movie, a real tentpole movie, really established the tone of what would become and be expected of summer blockbusters, especially superhero movies that would follow it. And there was a lot of, so he wasn't officially hired until after Beetlejuice box office came in. He enjoyed exploring the manic world of Batman and the Joker and the duality of Batman being this normal but rich guy but normal looking guy who has to put on a bat suit. So he avoided getting people who looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger or were real athletic types because he thought, why would they need to put on a bat suit, to look intimidating or to become someone else? Let's take a Joe Blow guy. He wants to look intimidating, so he has to put on the costume in order to transform himself. Fans, I don't know how many people remember this, fans hated initially when they found out that Michael Keaton, so this was after Beetlejuice, after Mr. Mom, he was seen as a comic actor, was cast for Batman, and Batman fans feared that it was going to be like the campy 1960s version, but they had no intention of doing it that way. They wanted to give it real characters, a darker tone, and when the film came out, it made a huge budget. I think they said it was the biggest profit of a movie up to that time, in fact. So, that definitely was successful, but there were a lot of concessions. He said the script was always being changed as they're working on it. There was a famous line where Jack Nicholson's going up the tower as the Joker, and he goes, well, what happens when why am I going up the tower? And Tim Burton goes, well, when you get there, we'll figure it out. So basically waiting on pages, things are changing. So with that frustration of doing it when he was asked back after it was successful, he had a lot more carte blanche to do the second Batman movie. And it definitely looks more Tim Burton-y when you look at the characters and you look at, the Penguin and all the sets. You can definitely see a lot more of his fingers and his sensibilities all over that one. I think I have the trailer for Batman. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it there. It's a little bit of a longer trailer, so some of them I won't show all the way through. But you definitely can see the visuals, the tone. And so that was the thing he always hears all his life is that, this thing is too dark. This thing's darker, And to him, he just finds it to be a very, subjective term, of what's too dark, what's too light. He finds something like Lethal Weapon 2 where people are, in broad daylight and smiling and shooting guns, and he finds that to be dark and disturbing as opposed to just having something be about characters who the lighting happens to be dark. Okay, so everyone in the whole world has been misperceived. So we've talked about how he always loved Frankenstein and the monsters. He was never scared by them. He always felt sorry for them. He always felt he could relate to the monsters a lot more than to the human characters in the stories. And so you see that carry through in his work. And so I think the next one is Edward Scissorhands. Yep. So 1990. So after doing, 3 successful movies, including a blockbuster, he decides to do a very small, intimate piece based off of a drawing he did of a character who had scissors for hands. Okay, so it was tricky for him to pull it off because once you have a big name now, he said there were a lot of locations he couldn't get because people figured you had money, and so they could charge you a lot of money. So he struggled to try to keep it quiet and kind of downplay it, that he was the director. So that they could, get locations and not have people, try to overcharge, because this was a very small budget film. This is seen by critics as being one of his best, if not best films. It's definitely his most autobiographical in terms of relating to how he felt growing up and in school and even in later in life. So it has hallmarks of the Burtonesque idea of misunderstood creature. You've got a laboratory with a scientist with Vincent Price right at the beginning. You've got a fairy tale, suburbia. So suburbia comes up again and again because of him growing up in the suburbs. So we'll take a look at the trailer for Edward Scissorhands. So how many of you here have seen Edward Scissorhands? Okay, so most of you. So this was his first film working with Johnny Depp, who would become a longtime collaborator, as most of you know. For this film, they had a lot of names that were floated past him with people. He even met with Tom Cruise for Edward Scissorhands, and he had a lot of questions about it. So eventually he met with Johnny Depp, and he didn't know his work. He didn't know who Johnny Depp was. He was doing, the 21 Jump Street and was kind of seen as a teen idol, which is something Johnny Depp really wasn't into being. And you could tell just from meeting with them that they were kindred spirits. They were both sort of introverted. They both were, communicated in a similar way. And they really likes people who can, through their eyes, who can emote, where you can just look at them and kind of get a feeling from them. And so he thought he would be good for this character that, does not speak a lot and has to emote a lot and show innocence. Okay. Every day is Halloween, isn't it? For some of us. Okay, so a lot of people can say that Tim Burton lives in a perpetual Halloween in his own mind of coming up with imaginative characters, creatures, and so forth. Next slide. So that brings us to The Nightmare Before Christmas. Okay, so I'm going a little bit slower through some of his pieces through the 80s and into the 90s because they really set a tone of what we think of as, Burtonesque and what we expect Burton films today to be sort of similar to, or things we look for. So with Nightmare Before Christmas, it was a character and a concept he came up with while he was working at Disney. And so they owned all the rights to anything that you draw or do while you're working for them. So now they had a name. They were able to go back, and Disney got behind the project, and they wanted to do the entire thing as a stop-motion animation film. How many people have seen Nightmare Before Christmas? Okay, so definitely check it out if you haven't had an opportunity. It's seen as basically very quintessential Burton. That his brain could be put in completely into a film. It would look like Nightmare Before Christmas with the crazy characters, but all with hearts of gold. The monsters are not there to scare you; they're there to delight you. He did not direct it, even though it's called Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. They thought that would help with the sales. He was very intimately involved with it being his style, but because of the magnitude of it being a feature-length stop-motion film, Henry Selick, his friend, directed it, and he worked closely with him on it. Danny Elfman wrote the songs and lyrics. In fact, they had all that before they brought on Carolyn Thompson, I believe, to do the script. So they kind of pieced it together, like, here's the story. Danny would write a song, play it for Tim, go back and forth, and kind of built the story that way. And it's become a holiday classic, one that you can watch at Halloween and at Christmas.
So I'm just trying to understand if he wrote it and he oversaw everything.
Right.
I mean, was he a producer, co-producer?
He was producer. He was a
what was he built?
He was a producer, probably executive producer, I'm guessing, but definitely in a producer role for that. So I mean, it was his creation, his idea, but someone else had to do the day-to-day because stop motion animation takes several years. It's one thing to make a short film like Vincent. It's another to make an hour and a half, almost hour and a half film that's stop motion. I think it's 80 minutes, maybe something like that. Next. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here's a trailer for Nightmare. So in case. Okay. Danny Elfman also does the singing voice for Jack Skellington, and another actor does Chris Sarandon. Thank you, Chris Sarandon, who is in The Princess Bride as as Humperdinck, right? Did the speaking voice for Jack. So go ahead, next slide. So I'm going to try to pick up the pace here. There's a lot of films to get through. So let's take a break at the moment and look at some of these recurring themes. So we talked about things that we see happening in Tim Burton movies because these have connections to him in some way. So we talked about misunderstood monsters with good hearts, family and fathers. So there are a lot of instances where people are dealing with their family or having dealing either affectionately or not affectionately with their fathers or parents. If you look at Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, or Big Fish, which we'll look at in a moment. Dual lives or personalities. We talked about Batman, but also like Edward Scissorhands, what he's perceived on the outside is not what he is on the inside. Split worlds, fairy tales, stories about artists or filmmakers. So, Edward Scissorhands is an artist. He can do hair, he can do sculpting. You've got Ed Wood, who is a filmmaker. You've got in Frankenweenie, in the stop motion version, the kid does stop motion. He's doing films. So you have that artistry coming through in some of the characters. And sometimes the normal world is the scary place, and the other world that we would perceive as the scary or weird place is the normal place. So if you look at Corpse Bride, the regular world is monotone and boring and all those things, monochromatic. You go into the world of the dead, and it's very colorful and happy. So there's basically an odds to what we sometimes perceive. And a lot of things to deal with childhood, characters who are children, or things that relate back to their childhood. Okay? It's good as an artist to always remember to see things in a new, weird way. Okay? So even though there are these things that repeat, he's choosing on each film. He just says, that's how I am. I like these things. I take on a project, and if it happens to have these things, that's great. He doesn't go out of his way to go, okay, I absolutely have to have stripes in this movie. I actually absolutely have to have a father in this movie. It works more if he talks like a style. It's like a drawing style. He says, I can't change my drawing style. That's how I draw. So this is how he makes movies. And so that becomes his style, just who he is. Next. All right, so we're going to cover these in a quicker succession and just show some shorter, some trailers to go with not all of these. How many people have seen Ed Wood? Okay, so Ed Wood is, I wouldn't even say hardly loosely based on the life of Edward D. Wood Jr., who was a down-and-out film producer, but very optimistic, getting things done, was voted the world's worst director of all time. But Tim Burton really liked the optimism he had of making movies. He's most famous for making Plan 9 from Outer Space. And Tim Burton had a respect for that kind of dedication to making these projects, getting them done. It also won, it was his first film that did not make back its money, even though it was done on a very low budget. Audiences did not come out to see it. But it did win Martin Landau an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, playing Bela Lugosi. Also won Rick Baker makeup. Best makeup job for him. Johnny Depp returned as Ed Wood, and it's also written by someone from South Bend, co-written by Larry Karaszewski, who would also go on with his partner Scott Alexander to co-write Big Eyes that Tim Burton directed in the last few years. Mars Attacks. I just watched an interview with Tim Burton where someone said, okay, so you made Mars Attacks, so what were you thinking? He goes, I don't know what I was thinking. I was in a weird mood at the time. It's based off of the bubblegum cards, that had aliens on them. Kind of coming off of Ed Wood, kind of that B-movie style mixed with those 70s disaster films where you have an all-star cast get picked off and killed, like the Towering Inferno and things like that. So he just wanted to have some anarchic fun with it. It just happened to coincidentally come out 5 or 6 months after Independence Day and became sort of an unintentional parody of that. But it again, I think it did okay at the box office, but nothing stellar. Finally, he sort of came back with Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow, really sort of for people who saw Mars Attacks or maybe didn't come out to see Ed Wood, really saw Sleepy Hollow as a comeback or like a really good film made by Tim Burton. So I think I've got the trailer for Sleepy Hollow, and it definitely has still Tim Burton comedy, but it's definitely a lot moodier, has a lot more kind of spooky and scares in it. So you can get a sense of the tone. They tried to look for some villages that looked right for what they wanted, but they ultimately ended up building their own, so they could be kind of wonky, kind of have, crooked and, a very stylized, period piece. Johnny Depp, of course, returns again for his third film with Burton. And then you have some other actors that over the last several movies have started to recur. He starts to work with people that he likes to work with again and again if he feels that they fit a particular part in his movie. So Tim Burton's known for working with a lot of the same people throughout. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, as we look at around 2001 to 2005, I got 4 films up here, all very, very different films, okay? You start off with Planet of the Apes, okay? So Planet of the Apes was one of those movies that it did make its money back, but you know, when you're comparing it to originals, and those were some of the things that Burton struggled with, was not just remaking a story, it's sort of a reimagining. One of the biggest problems he had with it is they kept changing the script again, and it had to be done by the next summer. They wanted to release it as a summer blockbuster. So he really had to make a lot of compromises. I think he broke a rib on the set, showing a performer how to fall or do something. So he said his health was, he said he always seems to get sick during a movie, especially the harder the movie is. So despite a lot of the struggles, it's definitely an entertaining film, and it's definitely not something you necessarily think of as a Tim Burton film. But if you watch it, you can still see a lot of those hallmarks to it. Big Fish was, again, back to a little more personal piece. It's definitely a different kind of film, and I'll show the trailer for that in a moment. And so you can find out more about that. Followed by Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. How many people saw Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Again, this sort of starts with, after Planet of the Apes and even Sleepy Hollow, starting with that idea of going with existing properties, things that a story or a movie that's already been made before, and putting his spin on it, putting his touch to it. So Charlie and the Factory, of course, Johnny Depp back. And then returning to stop motion animation, and this time he was director for The Corpse Bride, was his first directorial experience on a feature-length film, which how many people have seen Corpse Bride? So it has songs in it, deals with the world of the dead, of a character going into the underworld and so forth. Go ahead to the next slide, and we'll show the Big Fish trailer, because it's very Burton-y, but it's very different. It has fairy tale aspects, it has fathers, it has, interesting, bigger-than-life characters, and has a lot of actors come back who have been in his previous films, but it's got a little different tone. You can even tell in the music. Okay, so you can have at least a visual sense, a little bit of a different piece. He got a lot of good reviews for it. It was sort of remarked at the time that it was a Tim Burton movie for people who don't like Tim Burton. So if you want to take a look at it, and if you're not quite into his style, there's definitely made by him. You can see elements of it, but it is definitely a different kind of story and the relationships that take place in it. Next slide. Okay, 2007 to 2012, moving along. So Sweeney Todd, how many people have seen Sweeney Todd? So this is a piece that's been around for a while, very famous, and they went for it. They were able to use some of the actors he's used before, even though none of them had professionally sang before, doing a musical. And they were still able to sell Stephen Sondheim on that. He had final approval for who the cast was, singing he's responsible for writing Sweeney Todd. So definitely a very dark, very interesting movie. He still wanted, even though there's some green screen, he wanted a lot of sets for the actors. He always prefers tangible sets, if at all possible, even if they're mixed with green screen, so that the actors can better get into the world that they're living in. Next to that, though, leaping forward, Alice in Wonderland was very much a digital world. Okay, that was probably his most digital film ever. In some ways, it may have suffered because of it, but it definitely opened it up to anything is possible in this fantastic world. So they used a mixture of some real sets, but they did a lot of distorting with people's eyes, head sizes, body sizes, things like that in post-production. Dark Shadows. Okay, so after that, Dark Shadows came out based off of the soap opera from the 70s of the same name that followed a vampire who enters the lives of these people. So it's set in the 1970s, and so it had mixed reviews. It was some people saw it as tongue-in-cheek, some people thought it wasn't as funny. It definitely still has all the hallmarks of a Burton film in terms of style, look, and Johnny Depp. some reviewers commented that maybe his run with Johnny Depp, that maybe they should take a break from each other. They've done too many things together. That's really up to each of the viewer to kind of decide what they like. Sort of, does the movie work or does it not work? You either enjoy it or you don't. Then he started thinking about remaking Frankenweenie as a feature-length stop-motion animated film. After he was having an exhibit of his work, he saw some old drawings he had done of the dog and so forth for the storyboards and concepts for the live action short film. And so he decided to kind of go that route and remake it, expand on the story, and bring in some other creatures and monsters into it. How many people have seen Frankenweenie? Okay, so it's about a little boy whose dog dies and he brings it back to life, basically. Okay, next slide. So we'll take a look at the Alice in Wonderland trailer. So you can kind of see the contrast of using more of a digital world and how you feel that works with his style. Okay, so we'll leave it there. So basically you can definitely tell there's not a stop motion figure, character, or anything to be found, right? Nothing handcrafted, nothing handmade. Pretty much most of it being a digital background. You can definitely see that leap and decide whether you feel that still works or doesn't work, or whether you like when he has more hands-on stuff. But it was definitely an experiment of trying it, and the movie was successful overall, especially financially. So it was definitely a foray into a very green screen kind of world. Okay, next. Okay, so bringing up to the present, looking at Big Eyes. How many people got to see Big Eyes? Okay, it's one of those smaller, more intimate films, very much in the way that Ed Wood was when it came out. He's following big budget movies, following it with a smaller budget, tells the story of, if you've ever remembered the paintings of the children with the big eyes. So it was about Margaret Keane and how her husband basically, he lied and said that he was making the paintings because he thought that a man's name attached to it would be better, and he had an ego, and she really liked just kind of painting in private. And so it involved, how they became a phenomenon and how she eventually sued him, took him to court for, stealing her work, taking her work and putting it under her name. And they eventually ended up having, the judge ordered basically a draw off, a paint off. Okay, all right, Margaret, okay, and then the husband, paint a Big Eyes picture. And he had a hand cramp that day. Oh, I can't do it, So, so it's a very interesting story. And again, it was written by a local screenwriter, Larry Karaszewski, and with his co-writer, Scott. Then it brings us to last fall, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, which really seems like it has Tim Burton written all over it before you even, if you look at the book and you go through it, you're like, this would make a Tim Burton movie. So he said it was very easy for him to like this story about these children with unusual peculiarities and talents and abilities that make them maybe freakish to the rest of the world. And so that was very much in the vein of a Tim Burton style. If we take a look at the trailer for that.
I just had a thought, that's not the same kid that's playing Spider-Man, is it?
No.
Oh.
They all have big blue sparkling eyes. That's the requirement. Yeah.
That's the guy in Hugo. The little boy in Hugo.
Yeah, right.
Ender's Game.
Yeah, so you can see, and I think there's a little bit more because a lot of real-world locations, but the CG blends in a little bit more to complement rather than creating an entire world out of it. So, that can be said for any number of CG for films of, how much of the real world. I think there's always, when you can touch something like that building, that house is real, that always makes a bigger impact, I think. So go ahead and next. Visions are, and this is a quote, a fictitious quote, not really quoted by Orson Welles, but said by someone playing Orson Welles in Ed Wood. Visions are worth fighting for. Why spend your life making someone else's dreams? So he's in a position he can make the movies he wants to make. If he wants to make this, he'll make this. If he wants to make that, but studios are always, he never knows if he's going to be able to make another film. Studios still see him as not a quantifiable, director in terms of, what they're going to get from him. His style, we've seen all these things, but is it going to come across? How weird is it going to be? Do we have to say, oh, we don't want to see a film in black and white, or no, you can't use this actor again, or whatever limitation might be put on him. Films that he's directing. One is a live action version of Dumbo, which I'm still not sure how that would work. And also Beetlejuice 2, which has been probably kicking around ever since the first Beetlejuice when they wanted to do Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian, I think is what the script was going to be. So,
Great back then.
huh? Yeah. So Michael Keaton's like, hey, I'm available, so whatever. Yeah. He can make himself available. He wants to do it. He'd love to put on the Beetlejuice costume again, I'm sure. So go ahead to the next thing. Okay. So those are some things with the future. Does anyone have any questions, comments? This is really just the tip of the iceberg. He has worked in some television shows, and he has produced a number of other films. I just tried to highlight the ones he directed or was most involved with.
Yeah.
David?
Yeah, there's a documentary about the death of Superman Lives,
Yes.
which was basically there's a time period when he was attached to Superman,
Mm-hmm.
and which was why it took so long in between Superman 4 and Superman Returns. And basically,
Right, with Nicolas Cage as Superman.
yeah, and actually seeing the documentary, and you're like, this would actually make a really good Superman movie better than what we got.
I know Tim Burton, and I want to recommend some books. I recommended that art book. Burton on Burton is really good. His interviews with Tim Burton. It goes up through maybe the early 2000s. It's got Sleepy Hollow and Charlie in it, I think. But he talks about how much time he ended up wasting developing and working on Superman Lives, trying to get it off the ground. Putting time and energy into things that don't happen. Another quickie book is this one, Masters of Cinema, Tim Burton. I think all these you can get on Amazon. This is a nice nutshell, just takes you through almost everything. I think it goes up through Alice. This one is more complete. It goes all the way through Peregrine. I see this is now sort of my Burton Bible. It's Tim Burton, the iconic filmmaker, and his work. It's on Amazon. So it's really good. It's got a lot of great pictures, interviews. It's got a Burton timeline in it, and all kinds of things. One reason besides liking Tim Burton, one reason I've delved in more is that I'm currently been in development for several years of a Tim Burton tribute, homage, parody called Burton Juice. That we'll probably shoot in a few years when we get enough money and time and resources to do it any kind of justice. But we've developed the story for it. We've got the first act completely written out, and my co-creator Michael Carbetis and I have been working diligently on it in between other projects that we've got going on. And so it's basically, think Alice in Wonderland. You end up in this other world, or Wizard of Oz, but you end up in Tim Burton's brain, essentially. So you have a young character who's an artist filmmaker who falls into this world of our version of Tim Burton movies. So we don't have Edward Scissorhands. We have Edward, Swiss Army hands, and he and Sweeney Todd, or Swiney Todd basically run a barber shop together, and they're also involved with each other. So, things like that where we put twists on some of the familiar characters. The headless divorced man, for example, when it sounds like Christopher Walken, but he has no head. His wife took his head in the divorce. So characters like that you'll meet kind of along the way, twists to it. Any other questions?
I also kind of want to add as well, since you mentioned Peregrine being like about creepy kids. He also wrote a book that is like a conglomeration of creepy kids called The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy and Other Stories.
Yep.
That one's available on Amazon along with various plush and action figure-like toys. On top of that, if you go on YouTube, you can look up the Stain Boy animated series, in which it's 6 episodes long. Each episode, I think the longest counting credits is 3 minutes long, and it takes the character of Stain Boy, which you could kind of view as a metaphor for Superman, and how he's going and meeting other characters from the Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy book.
Right. Yeah, and you get to see more of his drawing style and those world, and he wrote the book, and wrote the the limericks or whatever, the poetry for the Oyster Boy book series. So that's a good point. So he has his hands in a lot of different things. I want to show this just as a bit of humor from collegehumor.com. It's basically sort of parodying the idea of what they perceive as maybe the predictability of a Tim Burton movie, some of those aspects that we were addressing. You'll see them kind of poked fun at here in this. This Tim Burton is also much more garrulous than the real Tim Burton. The real Tim Burton's a lot more withdrawn. Okay, next
I
slide.
watch it.
Yeah. So like I said, much more animated. If you've ever seen an actual interview with Tim Burton, he's very, very mellow, low-key, introverted type kind of guy. So these are some of the works cited, some of the books that I used here for it, as well as a couple of websites for gathering information. So I know we're almost out of time, but I could take one more question if anyone has one.
When did you start liking Tim Burton? Or when did you find?
When did I find? It was very gradual because I was thinking of, I've always liked his work, especially, let's see, what was the first Tim Burton movie I saw? Probably in high school, in the late 90s. So and in early 2000s, definitely Nightmare Before Christmas, but I liked Beetlejuice pretty much from the start. I liked, Edward Scissorhands I saw in high school. It really wasn't until I was looking for another project to work on. I was thinking again, as Tim Burton does, what am I interested in? What do I like? What do I want to put time and my energy into? So I was just looking at my big, DVD, shelf and thinking, okay, I'm just going to browse it and see if anything sort of a pattern or a movie sticks out. Well, I'm like, there's a Tim Burton movie. There's a Tim Burton movie. There's a Tim Burton. Oh my God, I should do a Tim Burton movie that's all of Tim Burton movies put together. And I went, oh my God, everyone's going to love it and it's going to be really hard. So that's why I've been kind of picking at it little by little. That was just before we made the Throbbit. So that was the script I was going to start that was summer of 2012. That I got the idea, basically, and then we kind of put it aside to make a film we could make, made that, and again, we're continuing to kind of go that route of working on it. We get together about every week and work on the script. It's just a lot of dissecting, analyzing Burton's films, making it so it's not just, we want it to be very nuanced and to have not just be, ha ha ha, parody, it's got jokes in it, but it should feel like a Tim Burton film. As much as possible, and so that's, and I'm still interested in it, so it was the right choice, all these years later of after coming up with the idea, 5 years later, still thinking about it, so working on it. Well, thank you all very much. You've been a great audience, and I appreciate all your feedback and comments. So thank you.
Thank you.